Assalamu alaikum everyone. Welcome to your fifth video of this tutorial series on building Java using Axum and askama template engine. In this video we are going to add login using session. Not a lot of buzzword but so many things to cover. So let's get started. This is a very simple client server diagram. Here the client is the web browser. You already know that the client sends HTTP request and then the server sends back response. In reality, server is someone else's computer. The client visits that computer, do some computation or view some HTML files. Also, the client can store some data and retrieve that data later. The server actually stores the data in some hard disk, also known as database. The server needs to know the user to show user-specific content, like you want to access your own files. You don't want to let someone else to see your data, so it's essential to implement some sort of authentication. Now the client creates an account using email and password, also known as sign up. Therefore, the server can have the information about the client which is stored in the database, but the server receives hundreds and thousands of requests per second. The server can't identify if two consecutive requests are made by the same client. Each request is stateless. So the server requires the client to provide the email and password every time the client makes a request. So the server checks the database and verifies, and that's annoying. Now the server has no other choice to verify each request, so we can't remove the authentication part. Well, the solution is to maintain the state using session and cookies. The client now will reach to the server and provide email and password, the same credential used during sign up. And then the server will go to the database, check and verify the user. If finds a valid registered client, then the server will create a session ID, which is just a random string unique to each client. Then it will store that in session storage with necessary data and expiry date. So later the server can access the data using the session ID. Generally you use in-memory database like Redis, but in this tutorial we will use Postgres to store. Now after that the server sends a response with the session ID, then store that ID to browser's cookies, which is a small local storage, and this is called login. Therefore, next time when the client makes a request to the server, the client attaches the session ID. Then the server takes the session ID, look at the session storage, and if finds a valid client, then it will go and get the user data from the database. So we will store the user ID so the server can make query data, like get the list of to-dos and give it to the user. And this is how the server communicates with the authenticated client. And that was a short tutorial on session and cookies topic. Now let's go ahead and implement login. So open user.rs file inside data folder, and after create user function, create a public async function and call it authenticate user. Similar to create user, this function will also take Postgres connection pool, email and password, and it will return result type, and we will return user ID which is of type i32 and the data error. Inside this function we are gonna query a user with this email address. So let's go ahead and write the query and choose the second one, which is the query macro. So inside that we will select the ID and the password hash column. I could have chosen a better name, but it's too late. From users table, where the email is equal to $1, which is the first parameter, and we will pass email. So this email, since we will fetch one row, so call fetch1, and then pass the connection pool, then await, and then add the question mark to propagate the error. Now this returns a user row, so we can store it in a variable, and let's call it user. Now it's complaining because this function returns an integer value. Let's return 1 for now, and that will make the compiler happy. Now if you remember when we created a new user, so our hash password was of type string, and then we converted it to byte slice, and then we inserted this value into the database. Therefore, when we query our password, we get as a byte slice. So now we have to convert it back to string type. So let's create a variable and call it hash password, and then use from utf8 function, then pass user.password hash. Now this returns a result type, so add a question mark. Now this password is hashed password, and this password which user submitted is a plain text password. And you already know that the hashing algorithm is one-way hashing. We can't convert it back to plain text. Bcrypt has a useful function called verify. So you can pass the plain text password and hash password, and it will compare them and it will check if the plain text password gives the output same as this hash password. If matches, then return true, else return false. So we can store that in a variable. Let's call it valid password. This hash password must be reference string, so add the ampersand. And this returns a result type, so add a question mark. Once we check if the password is valid or not, we can add the if-else statement. And when the password is invalid, we can return error variant, and inside that we can return failed query data error and pass this message, and failed query error message will be passed to the client. And when the password is valid, we can return OK, and then we can return the user ID, user.id. Now get rid of this OK return at the end. Now if you notice that we are getting an error when we are trying to convert the byte slice password to string type, because the data error is not of type from utf8 error, which is returned from this function when we call. So open errors.rs file inside data directory. Just like we added any other error types, we can also add from utf8 error, and there is nothing new to explain. Now we are querying an user using the email address. Now it could be that there is no user with that email address. Now we are going to deal with this error. Now after the await, we can add .map error, and inside that, as you already know, that we get access to SQLX error. This will be inside the closer. Now we are gonna match on row not found, and then return failed query data error. Then pass the same error message we passed when the password was invalid. So we can just copy and paste that. And for default error, we can return query error, as you probably already know that, and pass E, which is SQLX error. And now if we just save, and it will format the code. If you notice, we are returning same error message for invalid email and password, because according to Open Web Application Security Project recommend to use generic error message like invalid credentials when handling login errors. That's why we are returning same error message. Now with that, our authenticate user function is done. So now let's go to auth.rs, which is inside handlers folder. So after the login handler, let's create another handler function, call it post login handler. And as usual, it will also return result of response and app error. So copy and paste that here. Similar to post sign up handler, post login handler will also take state of app state and form of auth form model. Just in case you forgot this, our sign up and login both has email and password input field. Therefore, we can use the same form model. So we can just copy this and paste here. Now again, just like post sign up handler, we will first check if the user form is valid. So we can add a match statement, then call validate on user form. That will give us OK variant when the form is valid and error when the form is invalid. Now inside this block, everything will be identical to post sign up handler. So we can go up and we can copy everything which is inside the error block. Copy that and paste that here. Now you can definitely extract these into a separate function. Feel free to do that. I'm not gonna do that. Anyways, instead of rendering sign up template, we will render login template. So let's go ahead and update that. Now login template struct doesn't take these fields. So let's go to templates inside models folder. Then update login template struct. We can just copy these fields from sign up template and paste here. And also add tick a lifetime. Now go back to auth.rs file. So inside the OK block, we will now authenticate the user. So we can call authenticate user from user. And then we can pass our connection pool, email and password. Then add await at the end. Authenticate user returns result of user ID and data error. So we can store that in a variable and let's call it user ID. Since we are going to deal with the error, so we can use a match statement on user ID. Inside the match statement, we get the OK and the error variant. Now after we call authenticate user function, then if it returns OK, which means we validated that we have a registered user with this user ID. So now we have to create a session and store it. We can use tower session. So go to cargo.toml file and add these two dependencies, tower session and tower session SQLX store with feature Postgres. Then close that file. Now first thing we have to do is we have to set up the session store. So go to init.rs file. Then at the top add these two imports, expiry and session manager layer from tower session and Postgres store from tower session SQLX store. These are really not import. We are using use keyword to use them, so we don't have to drill down the package name, then module using colon. Anyway, so after the database connection, we can create another function. So let's go ahead and do that. Create a new public async function and let's call it session. And it will take PG pool. Inside that function, create a new session store called Postgres : new and pass the connection pool. The same connection pool we created when we set up Postgres database. This will take this connection pool and create a table to store session ID, data, and expiry date. And after that, call migrate on session store to create the table. Yes, we don't write any migration or schema, is done by this create. This returns a result, so we can add expect to get failure message when it does crash the server. Then create a new session manager layer and pass the session store. This creates a new session with session ID, then we can insert data. Now we don't want to keep the user logged in forever. We want to invalidate the session after a certain time. In our case, set the expiry time to 1 day. Now it's complaining because we have to add time dependency. But before we add the dependency, let's return session layer and also update the return type. Now go to cargo.toml file, then import time. Now close that file, then the error should go away. So now we have to hook everything up. So go to main.rs file. So after we set up database connection, let's set up our session. So init : session and then pass PG pool. Now this returns session layer if you remember. Now we have to add the session layer to router. So call layer, then pass session layer. Now before we go back to auth.rs file, let's go to routes.rs and then import post login handler. Then on login route, we already have a get method. Now add a post method, then add a reference to post login handler. Now go to auth.rs file and we can see the login template is complaining. So add some default values. Add empty strings for all fields. Now we can see our main.rs file started to complain. It's complaining because pgpool has moved inside session function. Therefore, we can't call it after that. So we have to call clone to create deep copy, which will create a copy of the same variable in a different memory location. And for now, we can use clone, but in the future video, if I remember, I will show you how to use reference counting instead of deep copy. Don't worry about this now. Now open auth.rs file. Now at the top, import session from Tava sessions. Then add session of type session to the post login handler and make sure you add before form extractor. Now inside the OK block, we get access to user ID, which is a valid user ID. Now inside this block, we can insert our user ID to the session store. So call insert on session. We can use any unique key we want. Then later we can use that key to retrieve user ID. And let's call this key authenticated user ID. And the value will be user ID. And then we have to add await. And then this returns a result type, so we can add a question mark. Now this is showing an error because we have to update our app error. So let's go ahead and do that. Open errors.rs file inside handlers. Then add another enum variant to app error, which is from Tava sessions error. Now we also have to update this match statement. So add session app error, then return server error function, which is identical to other two errors. Now you might think, what's the point of handling each error cases and then return server error? Why not just return a default arm E and then return server error? Well, that will obscure the underlying error and the error message. So we will get some generic error log like app error. Therefore, we have to add arm for all app errors. Close that file and then go back to auth.rs file. Now here, we are inserting user ID to session storage. The Tava sessions crate will take care of creating, updating and validating the session. We don't have to write any logic for that. It's complaining because we have to return a response from here. So return a redirect response to /to-dos. Also return the same redirect from error block for now. And finally, let's go to login page. Now inside the main block, we are returning a h1 tag. So delete that. So I'm going to copy and paste that. You can get the source code from the link in the video description. Everything will be same as signup.html file. Then outside the main block, add the CSS block and link to auth.css file. Now let's go ahead and run our server. Then open your browser and go to localhost 8000. Then go to login. And if we submit, then we can test if our form validation is working, and it's working. If you remember that we signed up using an email address which is test@gmail.com and the password was 128. So before I click on submit, I'm going to open the dev tool, then go to application, then go to cookies and then select localhost 8000. And then if we submit, then you can see that a new cookie was added. Let me just expand this. And you can see that there is a value. This is the session ID, then the expiry date, which should be 1 day. Now we saw how session ID is stored in browser cookies. And now let's go to the terminal and check our database. We don't see any table for session store, because Tava session stores tables in a different schema, and we can check that we have another schema which is for Tava sessions. So now we can change our schema to Tava sessions. Now if we check the database tables, then we can see we have a table named session. So let's go ahead and query that table. And we can see there is an ID which is for session ID, then data which is of type byte, and expiry date. And if we check our browser cookie value, then it's the same as this session ID. I hope you understand everything. We also get log from Tava sessions. Now we don't see the package name because we hide it, but these are from Tava session. Anyway, now at this moment, if I close the dev tool, and if I refresh the page and we logged in, we are now showing different views. Like when we are signed in, we don't want to show the sign up and log in button. Instead, we want to show log out button. So let's go ahead and work on that. Now before we do something, we need to talk about something called middleware. This is a very simple diagram of request and response, and you can see the handler function which returns HTTP response to the client. So middleware is basically a function that can be added before handler function. It's not just one, we can add as many we want. For the sake of simplicity, I just added only one. It's like a function that holds some common logic for multiple handler functions. Otherwise, we could have written everything inside handler. These are used to update or edit the request. Like in our case, we can add the middleware that will check each request if they are authenticated or not. Anyway, this function takes the request object, do something with that request, and then return that request wrapped inside something like next function. Therefore, the next middleware or handler function can get the edited or updated request. Middleware can also return HTTP response to the client if needed. And that was a short tutorial on middleware. So now we are gonna create a middleware. So let's just collapse every folder so you can see it. So open lib.rs file, then add a module called middleware with s at the end. Then inside the src folder, create that module. Now before we create our middleware function, let's go to models app.rs file, then create a model struct, call it current user. Basically, we are going to create current user object with these fields: is authenticated and user ID. Then we will attach it to the request and pass it to next middleware so that the next function can pull out these fields from the current user object. And don't worry about why user ID being option type. You will see it soon. Close that file and let's go to middleware.rs file, and inside that go ahead and import these imports. The only thing is new, the next middleware. Now let's create our first middleware function, public async function, and let's call it authenticate. And this function will take session, then mutable request because we want to update the request, and then the next middleware function. Now inside this function we are going to query session and look for the user ID which is stored. So session.get, and then we also have to annotate the return type which is i32. If you remember the user ID which was of type i32, and then the same key which was authenticated user ID, and then await. So let's store the return value in a variable, call it user ID. It returns a result type, so add the question mark. Now this returns a option user ID, so we can use if-less statement to check if the user ID is some type or non-type, which means if there is a user ID or if there is no user ID. Inside this block, create current user object. Set is authenticated to true because we have a valid user ID here. Therefore, the user is authenticated. Then user ID which is of type option, so pass some ID. Then add a semicolon at the end. Now once we created the current user object, we are going to store that inside request so that next function, either middleware or handler function, can access that. And we can store data inside extensions. If we visit the official doc of Axum extensions, and we can see this written, extensions can be used by request and response to store extra data. It also has an insert function to insert data. So let's go ahead and use that. Request.extensionMute. Make sure to choose the second one since we are going to modify the request. Then call insert and pass the current user object. Once that's done, return the request. So call run on next, then pass the request and then await. And it's complaining because we need to now update our return type. And let's go ahead and update the return type, which is result of response and app error. And we have to wrap this in OK block. Now we have to return response from else block. So we need to create a current user here. So we can just copy and paste this and update it. Since we haven't found any user ID, is authenticated is false and the user ID is none. Then again we have to store that in request and return that request. So we can just copy and paste it from if-let block. Now we created current user object twice and that allocated memory twice. So instead we should create this object outside and update the fields. So we can just cut and paste from else block. Inside this block, we just have to update the current user object. So delete this from here and we have to make this variable mute when we initialize it. So now update the current user inside if let block, set is authenticated to true and user ID to some ID. And we don't need to do anything from inside else block. Open routes.rs file and then first import the middleware from Axum. Then also import authenticate middleware from middlewares which we just created. Now before we added our state, add a layer. Then call the middleware which we imported from Axum, then colon and then from function and then our middleware function which is authenticate. This middleware function will run before all routes. If you remember, I told you middleware functions are executed from the bottom to top. Now once that's done, we can go to navigation.html file. Now inside this nav, after the home button, we can add a if-else block. If the user is authenticated, then we will show create and to use button. Otherwise, sign up and login button. And now add a logout button when the user is authenticated, which will make a post request to /logout route. Also update these buttons order. Anyway, next we have to go to templates.rs file because we have to provide is authenticated to all pages. So add a public boolean field is authenticated to all structs. Now let's go to handler function and provide the is authenticated. And you can see it's already started to complain. So go to public.rs file, then add extension from Axum, then also import current user from models. And we can use extensions extractor to extract the stored data which we stored in request extensions. Now this function will take extension of type current user as input argument similar to form and state extractor. We can destructure that to a variable, let's call it current user. Once that's done, we can pass is authenticated to home template current user.is authenticated. And I made a mistake here. We shouldn't unwrap, we should add a question mark because we are returning app error. Now let's do the same for todos.rs file. As usual, import extension and current user. Get the current user and pass the is authenticated to each template. And again, remove unwrap and add question for both of these handlers. Now let's go to errors.rs. And inside the server error, we can hard code that is authenticated to false. Now finally go to auth.rs and update all handlers. But first we have to import the extension and the current user model. As usual, add extension extractor input argument, then pass is authenticated to templates. And this will be same for all handlers, so I'm going to speed this thing up. And you see, I again forgot to remove the unwrap from login handler, so go ahead and do that. Now let's go ahead and run our server and see. I stopped this, so I have to run. Go to your browser. First thing, for some reason my theme is ruined for logout button. So let's go and check it. You probably won't have this issue. I added an extra ending tag. Now let's go to the browser again. And you can see when we are logged in, we don't see sign up and login button. For now, we don't have any mechanism to log out. We can go ahead and delete the browser cookies and that will log us out. And reload the page. Now I am logged out and I am still able to view to-dos page. We shouldn't be able to view when we are not logged in. So we have to prevent this. So let's go ahead and do that. Now let's go to middleware.rs file. So first import cache control POM HTTP headers, then extension, and finally redirect POM response. And then after authenticate middleware, create another middleware, add public async function and call it required authentication. And this function will take these arguments. I just copied and pasted. You already know them. There's nothing new in it. The only difference is the request is not mutable. Now inside this function, first we will check if the current user is not logged in or not authenticated. Then we will redirect to login page and it's complaining because we have to add the return type which will be response. And otherwise outside this if block we can return the response. So call next run and pass the request and we have to call await. Now this run function returns a response. So we can store that in a variable. So let's go ahead and store that in a variable and call it res. We can get access to response headers and you can see there are two headers and choose the second one which is mutable headers. So we can insert the header and the key will be cache control which we imported and the value will be no store. Now once we inserted our header we can return the response. Then this variable will be mutable, so add mut or mute. Now we added a require authentication middleware. So let's go to routes.rs file. Then after the router function, create another function. And let's call it protected routes. And it will return router of app state. Now inside that function, first create a new router. Now we are going to add routes that require to be authenticated. So cut create and to-dos route from above router function. Then paste inside protected routes. Then after that add a route layer. Inside here pass middleware which is from Axum ::from fn. We are going to add required authentication middleware. So to do that we have to first import that. Obviously we forgot to import. So import here. Now go and add the reference and don't add a semicolon at the end because we want to return this router. Now once that's done, after all these routes, call merge function. Now it doesn't have to be after all these routes. I said that because it has to be before authenticate middleware. Now here call protected routes. Make sure to call it by adding parentheses at the end. Alright, so save the change and our server should restart by itself. If you have stopped it, then go ahead and restart it. Now go to the browser and then reload. And if we try to access to juice route, and we should be redirected to login, and we are now redirected to the login page. Alright, that's it for this tutorial. I was going to add logout and some small features, but it's getting longer. So don't forget to watch the next video. If you have any questions, then leave them in the comment. If you like this video, then give me a like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Assalamu alaikum.